There is a small gesture that repeats throughout the day, almost unnoticed. The hand moves before any clear decision forms. The screen lights up. Sometimes it doesn't even vibrate. There is no important message, no real urgency. Still, the movement happens. Minutes later, it happens again. Not as obvious anxiety, not as clear boredom, something quieter, as if attention had learned to leak whenever an empty moment appears, like water finding the easiest crack. In many moments, the scene looks the same. A task open that progresses slowly. A video paused halfway through. A tab that should have been closed but remains. The phone nearby, present even in silence. Between one thought and the next, a brief impulse to check. No conscious choice, just a quick glance, then another. By the end of the day, the feeling is not that the phone was used too much, but that everything was interrupted constantly, as if almost nothing had been done all the way through. This behavior goes unnoticed because it doesn't feel excessive. Each individual gesture is too small to raise concern. The issue isn't the action itself, but the silent repetition. Throughout the day, attention rarely stays in one place long enough to settle, and this begins to happen without anyone clearly noticing when exactly the habit was formed. This pattern is often explained in simple terms: lack of focus, too many distractions, just a modern habit. But those explanations stop too early, because in most cases it isn't disinterest or inability to concentrate. Many people who check their phones constantly are functional, productive, mentally active. They think fast, respond fast, keep up with everything. The issue isn't the absence of attention, but the difficulty of sustaining a single mental state for any length of time. From a psychological and behavioral perspective, attention doesn't work like an on-off switch. It works through permanence. Staying focused requires tolerating small moments of inner silence, waiting, and mild cognitive tension. In environments filled with constant stimulation, this state begins to feel uncomfortable, not because it is difficult, but because it has become unfamiliar. The brain learns that there is always a faster alternative to fill any gap. Over time, the mind begins to associate pauses with emptiness, and emptiness with something to be avoided. The phone appears precisely at that point, not as a source of intense pleasure, but as a quick exit, a brief relief, an interruption that prevents attention from staying long enough to deepen anything. This doesn't happen by conscious choice. It happens because the brain has been trained to respond this way. There is a less visible aspect of this behavior that often goes unnoticed. Constant checking doesn't arise only when something external calls for it. It frequently appears right before something requires real permanence, before a longer task, before a simple but uncomfortable decision. Before a thought that would take time to organize. The impulse doesn't come from the phone. It comes from the moment just before the phone. From a neuroscience perspective, this is tied to anticipation. The brain learns to predict that switching stimuli will bring some form of quick return, a new piece of information, a light distraction, a sense of movement. Even when that return doesn't arrive, the expectation alone is enough to interrupt the current effort. Distraction happens by prediction, not by accident. Behaviorally, this creates subtle reinforcement. Switching tasks, checking something new, shifting focus produces small chemical releases linked to curiosity. They aren't deep rewards, but they are frequent. Gradually, the brain begins to prefer alternation over permanence. Staying too long in a single activity starts to generate a mild, persistent discomfort, not pain, restlessness, and that discomfort becomes the real trigger for checking. This functioning has effects beyond momentary attention. When the mind is interrupted repeatedly, something accumulates quietly, a sense of incompletion. Tasks are started, thoughts are outlined, decisions begin to form, but few things are carried through to the end. Internally, there is a feeling of always being in the middle of something, never stopped but rarely finished. Over time, this creates a specific kind of fatigue, not physical tiredness, not intense emotional exhaustion, but a diffuse mental weariness that is hard to pinpoint. The day feels active but without density. There is movement but little internal weight. The mind reacts constantly but rarely stays, and staying is what turns effort into a sense of progress. There is also a direct impact on decision-making. Deciding requires holding an option in the mind long enough for doubts to organize themselves. When attention fragments too quickly, decisions remain suspended. They are not rejected, just postponed. This creates a constant feeling of being behind, even when everything appears under control externally. The day passes, tasks remain open, and something is always left for later, without it being clear what. Over time, this pattern begins to affect something deeper than productivity or focus. It alters how life itself is perceived. Days pass too quickly, weeks feel short. When trying to remember what happened recently, memories appear blurred, without clear contours. Not because nothing happened, but because few experiences were sustained long enough to become internal reference points. In the psychology of memory, what remains in attention longer tends to gain meaning. What is passed through quickly leaves few emotional traces. When the mind spends the day alternating stimuli, the brain records movement, not continuity. The result is a life that is busy, yet subtly empty. Constant activity, but little sense of a story being built. This effect often produces a vague unease, the feeling that time is slipping away.
That something important is always being postponed. Even on full days, there is a sense that something essential was missing, not from lack of effort, but from lack of permanence. The mind was in many places, but rarely stayed long enough in one to leave a mark. Perhaps the most important point is not the phone itself, but the impulse that comes before it. The small gesture tends to appear when something begins to demand real presence. A slightly longer silence, a task without immediate payoff, a thought that would need time to mature. In those moments, checking becomes a preventive interruption. It doesn't respond to an external demand. It avoids inner permanence. Observing this impulse changes how the habit is understood, not as personal failure, nor as excessive technology use, but as a learned pattern, a brain trained to escape pauses before discomfort is even consciously felt. When this is noticed, something reorganizes. There is no immediate control, no forced change, just awareness. And awareness creates space. It may be worth noticing when this gesture appears most often, whether it arises before longer tasks, when silence stretches on, or when something important begins to require continuity. In many cases, attention isn't lost by accident. It is redirected before it can settle. When does this impulse usually appear? Here, these patterns are observed calmly.